The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It fell hard against the towers of the twins, turning the stone dark and heavy, like the sky itself was mourning something that had not yet happened. Inside the great hall, torches burned bright, music played, laughter echoed too loudly. But something felt wrong. Robb Stark sat at the high table, forcing a smile. His mother, Catelyn, sat beside him, her fingers tight around her cup. She felt it too. The air was thick, too many frays, too many closed doors, too many eyes watching. Across the hall, Walder Frey smiled like an old fox who had already tasted blood. Robb tried to ignore the feeling in his chest. He had made a mistake, breaking his vow. He knew that. But this was still guest right. Bread and salt had been shared. No lord would dare spill blood under his own roof after that. No lord with honor. The music suddenly grew louder. The doors at the back of the hall shut with a heavy boom, and that was when the first crossbow bolt flew. It struck a Stark bannerman through the throat. He dropped before anyone understood what had happened. For one heartbeat, the hall went silent. Then chaos exploded. More bolts rained down from the gallery above. Frey soldiers drew steel from beneath their cloaks. The musicians dropped their instruments and picked up blades. Robb stood so fast his chair crashed behind him. "To arms!" he shouted, reaching for his sword. But Grey Wind was locked outside. The direwolf howled in fury somewhere in the distance. Catelyn grabbed Robb's arm. "It's a trap." Another bolt hit the table inches from Robb's chest. The Freys were slaughtering them. Stark men fell one by one, drunk, unarmed, confused. Blood spilled across the wedding floor. Screams replaced music. And then, the great doors burst open. Not gently, not carefully. They exploded inward as if struck by a battering ram. Every head turned. A cold wind rushed into the hall, carrying rain and mud and something darker. At the doorway stood a group of black-cloaked men, Night's Watch, and at their front was Jon Snow. His hair was soaked. His sword was already drawn. His gray eyes took in the scene in a single glance, the bolts, the blood, Robb surrounded. For a split second, the world slowed. Robb stared at him in disbelief. "Jon?" Jon didn't answer. He moved. Tummal flashed silver in the torchlight. The Valyrian steel sliced clean through leather and bone. "With M.E.!" Jon roared. The few Stark men still standing surged toward him. The Night's Watch brothers who had ridden south with Jon charged into the hall without hesitation. Walder Frey's smile vanished. Roose Bolton, who had been slowly backing away from the chaos, froze when he saw Jon Snow. Jon fought like a man who had nothing left to lose. He reached Robb in seconds, cutting through two guards. Blood sprayed across his face, but he did not blink. "You shouldn't be here," Robb said, half stunned, half relieved. Jon blocked a sword aimed at Robb's neck. "Neither should you." Another bolt flew toward Robb. Jon stepped in front of him. The bolt struck his shoulder. He grunted but did not fall. Catelyn screamed. Jon ripped the bolt free and drove Longcline to the crossbowman above. The man tumbled from the gallery and crashed onto a table below. "Move!" Jon barked. "We fight out!" More Stark men rallied at the sight of him. The despair in the room shifted. It wasn't victory, but it wasn't surrender anymore. Roose Bolton quietly drew his blade. He stepped toward Robb from behind. Jon saw him. Their eyes met across the chaos. Jon understood in that instant. Not confusion. Not panic. Betrayal. "ROB!" Jon shouted. Robb turned just as Bolton lunged. Longclaw met Bolton's sword mid-strike. The clash rang through the hall like a bell of judgment. Bolton's pale eyes showed no emotion. "You always were in the wrong place, bastard." Jon shoved him back with raw fury. "And you were always a traitor." They circled, steel clashing again. Around them, the hall burned in violence. Freys were dying now, too. The element of surprise was gone. Robb grabbed a fallen shield and joined the fight. Bolton tried to retreat, but Jon pressed him hard, blow after blow. Rage fueled every strike. Bolton stumbled over a fallen body. Jon disarmed him with a brutal twist. Robb drove his sword through Bolton's chest. Roose Bolton fell without a word. Walder Frey began shouting for his men to kill them all. But it was too late. Outside, the sound of wolves filled the air. Not one, many. Grey Wind had broken free. And he was not alone. The northern soldiers camped outside had heard the fighting. They were forcing their way across the bridge. The Freys had planned a slaughter. Instead, they had started a war inside their own walls. Jon turned to Robb, breathing hard, blood soaking his cloak. "You're getting out of here," Jon said. Robb looked at him, really looked at him, not as a bastard, not as a half-brother, as family. "You disobeyed your vows." Jon's jaw tightened. "I chose my brother." Another wave of Frey soldiers charged. Jon stepped forward again, and this time Robb fought beside him. The Red Wedding was not over. But it was no longer a massacre. It was a battle, and House Stark was not dying tonight. The fighting did not slow down. It only grew louder. The great hall of the twins had turned into something unrecognizable. Tables were flipped. Torches had fallen. Smoke mixed with the smell of blood and wet stone. Men screamed in pain, rage, and fear. The wedding songs were long gone. Only steel sang now. Jon stood shoulder to shoulder with Robb. For years they had fought separately. Jon at the wall, Robb in the south. But in that moment, they moved like they had trained together their whole lives. One covered while the other struck. One stepped forward while the other guarded the flank. It felt natural. It felt right. Grey Wind crashed through the side doors like a living storm. His fur was soaked red, his jaws snapping, tearing through Frey men who tried to run. The sight of the dire wolf broke something inside the attackers. Fear spread quickly. "The wolf! Kill the wolf!" Someone screamed, but no one could get close. Catelyn Stark had picked up a dagger from a fallen guard. She stood near the wall, her back straight, eyes sharp. She was no helpless lady tonight. She had already cut one man across the throat when he rushed her. Across the hall, Walder Frey was being dragged toward a hidden exit by two of his sons. The old man's face had turned pale. This was not how it was supposed to go. The Starks were supposed to die drunk and confused. Instead, the bastard of Winterfell had brought hell with him. Jon saw Frey trying to escape. "Robb," he said, his voice tight. "He doesn't leave this hall." Robb didn't hesitate. He pushed forward, cutting down a Frey knight who tried to block his path. More Stark soldiers burst in from outside. They had forced the gates open once the fighting started. Arrows now flew from the doors inward, cutting down Frey men on the balconies. The balance had shifted, but it wasn't over. A horn suddenly blew from outside. Deep, long, warning. Jon froze for half a second. That wasn't a Frey horn. It came again, from beyond the bridge. Then he heard it, the thunder of hooves. Robb's face darkened. Lannisters. Jon nodded. They were waiting. The betrayal was bigger than just Walder Frey. Of course it was. This kind of trap needed powerful friends. Through the broken doors, golden banners could be seen in the rain. The lion had arrived. Inside the hall, the remaining Frey men fought harder now, desperate to hold the Starks long enough for the Lannister forces to trap them inside the castle. "We can't stay in here," Jon said. "It'll become a cage." Robb looked around quickly, calculating. Even now, in chaos, he was still a king. "How many men do we have outside?" "Enough to break through if we move fast," Jon replied. "Not enough to survive being surrounded." Catelyn reached them, her face streaked with smoke and blood. "Then we move now." Another crash shook the hall as Lannister soldiers began forcing entry from the outer yard. Jon grabbed Robb's arm. "You get Mother and the core of our men across the bridge. I'll hold them here." Robb shook his head instantly. "No. You're the king in the north," Jon said firmly. "If you die, this ends." "And if you die?" Robb shot back. Jon almost smiled. "I'm already a traitor to the Watch." There was no time to argue. Lannister soldiers poured into the courtyard, shields locked, spears ready. The twins had become a death trap between two enemies. Robb made the decision. "We push west," he commanded loudly. "Through the smaller gate. Break their line before it closes." The Stark bannermen rallied immediately. Even wounded, they obeyed. Jon turned back toward the main hall entrance as Lannister men forced their way inside. Their armor gleamed even in the firelight. A knight in golden armor stepped forward, removing his helmet. Jaime Lannister. He looked almost amused. "Well," Jaime said calmly, glancing at the carnage. "This wedding has taken an unexpected turn." Robb stiffened. Jon stepped forward instead. "You should have stayed in King's Landing." Jaime's eyes studied him. "And you must be the famous bastard." Jon didn't answer. He attacked. Longclaw met Jaime's blade in a violent clash. Sparks flew. Jaime was faster than most men Jon had ever faced. Even with the chaos around them, Jaime fought with precise control. Steel rang again and again. Jaime smiled slightly. "You fight better than your brother." Jon pressed harder. "He doesn't need to." Behind them, Robb and the Stark forces began pushing toward the side exit. Grey Wind tore a path forward, scattering soldiers. Jaime tried to break past Jon to reach Robb. Jon blocked him. Every strike grew heavier, angrier. Jaime twisted, nearly slipping past, but Jon caught him with a brutal shoulder hit that sent both of them crashing into a table. They rolled, blades locked inches from each other's throats. "You can't win this," Jaime said quietly. Jon's voice was low. "I don't have to. I just have to buy time." Outside, the sounds of Stark horns began to echo. They were breaking through. Jaime heard it too. His smile faded. Jon shoved him back and slashed across Jaime's thigh, not deep but enough to slow him. Jaime retreated a step, reassessing. Jon backed toward the exit, keeping his blade up. "Next time," Jaime said coldly. Jon didn't respond. He turned and ran toward the smaller gate where Robb and the others were pushing through the Lannister line. Rain poured harder now, washing blood into the river below. The Red Wedding had failed, but the war had just become far more dangerous, because now the Lannisters knew something they hadn't before. Jon Snow would choose Stark blood over any oath, and that made him more than a bastard. It made him a threat. The Stark forces finally broke free of the twins' walls, retreating into the storm-covered night. Behind them, the castle burned. Robb rode at the front, soaked and silent. Jon rode beside him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Robb said quietly, "You saved my life." Jon stared ahead into the dark road north. "We're not safe yet." And far behind them, in the burning ruins of betrayal, the lions began planning their revenge. The rain followed them for miles. It soaked their armor, their cloaks, their wounds. The retreat from the twins was not clean. Too many men had fallen. Too many banners were missing. The North had survived the trap, but it had not escaped untouched. They rode through the night without torches, moving fast and silent along the river road. No songs, no talking, only the sound of hooves and the distant rumble of thunder. Robb Stark finally called for a halt just before dawn. They had reached a stretch of forest thick enough to hide their numbers. The men were exhausted. Some were wounded badly. A few would not see another sunrise. Jon dismounted slowly. His shoulder burned where the crossbow bolt had struck him. He had tied cloth around it during the ride, but blood still seeped through. Catelyn approached him quietly. "You're hurt," she said. "I've been worse." She studied him for a long moment. There was something different in her eyes now. Not warmth exactly, but not coldness either. "You should not have come," she said softly. Jon met her gaze. "If I hadn't, Robb would be dead." She didn't argue. That alone felt like something had shifted in the world. Across the clearing, Robb stood with his remaining lords. Grey Jon Umber, wounded but alive. Idmure Tully, pale with shock. Several others missing. Roose Bolton's absence was noticed, but now they knew why. Treachery. Grey Jon growled. "We should march back and hang every Frey from his own walls." "We can't," Edmure said bitterly. "The Lannisters will be waiting." Robb looked at Jon as he approached. "They were working together," Robb said. "Frey and Lannister. Maybe more." Jon nodded. "Bolton too." The name fell heavy between them. Robb's jaw tightened. "I trusted him." You trusted him. You trusted too many, Jon said quietly. The words were not cruel, just honest. For a moment, silence sat between the brothers. Then Robb gave a small nod. You're right. That was the difference now. Something had changed at the twins. Robb wasn't just a king leading banners anymore. He had looked death in the eye and seen betrayal wearing a friendly face. We can't fight this war the same way, Robb continued. The rules are gone. Jon looked toward the north, toward home. Then we stopped playing by them. The men rested for only a short while before scouts returned with grim news. Lannister forces were spreading across the riverlands, locking down crossings, hunting survivors. Word would travel fast that the Red Wedding had failed. And when it did, the Lannisters would not be careful anymore. They would be ruthless. Robb gathered his commanders again. We march north, he said firmly. Not south, not toward King's Landing. We secure the neck and moat Kaelin. We rebuild strength where the lions cannot easily reach. Greytown frowned. Retreat, strategic survival, Jon corrected. Retreat, strategic survival, Jon corrected. Robb nodded. The North remembers, but it must live long enough to remember. The decision was made. As the army prepared to move, Jon pulled Robb aside. There's more, Jon said. Robb watched him carefully. The wall is weakening. Robb blinked. What? Jon took a breath. The wildlings are gathering in numbers I've never seen. Something is driving them south. And it's not just hunger. Robb studied his brother's face. You believe the stories? I've seen things, Jon said quietly. Dead things. Robb didn't laugh. Not after the twins, not after betrayal had already proven that monsters wore human faces. If the North faces war from the south and something worse from beyond the wall, Robb exhaled slowly. Then we need every sword. Jon hesitated. I broke my oath, he said. You chose family, Robb replied. The Night's Watch won't see it that way. Then the Night's Watch won't see it that way. Then the Night's Watch will answer to me, Robb said firmly. You're my brother, and the North needs you. Those words settled deep. For the first time in his life, Jon felt fully claimed. Not bastard. Not outsider. Stark. The army moved again before sunrise. Behind them, ravens were already flying from the twins, one toward King's Landing, one toward the Dreadfort, and far to the south, when the message reached the Red Keep, wine spilled across a golden table. The Lannisters had expected a clean victory. Instead, they had a wounded wolf still standing. And wounded wolves were the most dangerous kind. Back on the road, Jon rode slightly ahead of the column, eyes scanning the tree line. His shoulder throbbed, but he ignored it. Robb rode up beside him. When we reach the north, Robb said, we prepare differently. Jon glanced at him. How? Robb's voice was steady now, harder than before. We stop reacting. We start striking first. Jon felt something shift in those words. The boy who had marched south for honor was gone. The man riding beside him now understood something darker. If the Lannisters wanted treachery, the North could answer with something colder. The rain finally began to ease as they crossed deeper into familiar lands. But far behind them, in castles and cities, powerful enemies were already whispering new plans, because the Red Wedding had not killed the king in the North. And now, the game had become far more dangerous for everyone. The North welcomed them with cold wind and silence. When the battered army finally crossed into familiar lands, there were no cheers waiting, no songs, only watchful eyes from castle walls and small folk who had already heard rumors. Ravens flew faster than horses, and word of the Red Wedding and its failure had spread ahead of them. Winterfell's gates opened slowly. The sight of Robb Stark riding at the front, alive, sent a visible wave through the courtyard. Men who had prepared themselves for the worst stared like they were seeing a ghost. But when they saw how many banners were missing, the truth settled in. This had not been a victory, it had been survival. Inside the Great Hall of Winterfell, the surviving northern lords gathered. Fires burned high, but the air still felt heavy. Robb stood before them, no crown on his head tonight. Just a tired young man with dried blood still on his armor. They tried to slaughter us under guest right, he began, his voice calm but carrying. Walder Frey, Roose Bolton, and the Lannisters. A low growl moved through the hall. They failed, Robb continued, because we were warned. Eyes turned toward Jon. Jon stood near one of the pillars, black cloak hanging heavy from his shoulders. Some of the lords looked uncertain, some grateful, a few suspicious. Great Jon Umber stepped forward first. The bastard fought like a true wolf, he said loudly. I saw it with my own eyes. That broke the tension. More voices rose in agreement. Men who had survived the haul at the Twins spoke up. Jon's name passed through the crowd with growing respect. Catelyn watched it all quietly. Robb lifted his hand for silence. The war has changed, he said. We face enemies who have no honor. So we will answer carefully, coldly, and together. He began laying out the plan. Moat Cailin would be reinforced immediately, sealing the neck. Scouts would track every Lannister movement south of the Riverlands. Northern ships would begin harassing Lannister supply lines along the western coast. But that wasn't all. Robb's eyes shifted to Jon again. There is another threat, he said, from beyond the wall. Murmurs spread. Jon stepped forward this time. The wildlings are moving in massive numbers, he said plainly. They're not raiding, they're fleeing. Something is pushing them. Giants and grumpkins? One lord scoffed. Jon didn't flinch. I've seen the dead walk. Silence swallowed the hall. Robb didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss it. If there is even a chance this is true, Robb said firmly, we cannot ignore it. A tense debate followed. Some lords resisted. The North had enough enemies without chasing ghost stories, but others remembered old tales, old warnings. In the end, Robb made a decision that surprised them all. We will send men to reinforce the wall, he declared. Food, weapons, builders. The Night's Watch will not stand alone. Jon looked at him sharply. You're serious. Robb met his gaze. If the wall falls, nothing else matters. That night, as the hall emptied, Jon stood alone in the courtyard. Snow had begun to fall lightly, dusting the stone. Footsteps approached. It was Catelyn. For a moment, neither spoke. You defied your vows, she said finally. Yes. You may never be welcomed back by the Watch. I know. She studied him under the falling snow. You saved my son. Jon didn't answer. She swallowed slightly. It was not easy for her. You saved my king. It wasn't love, it wasn't warmth, but it was acknowledgement. For Jon, that was enough. The next weeks moved quickly. Ravens flew north to the wall, carrying Robb's seal. Supplies began moving. Blacksmiths worked day and night. The North prepared for two wars now, one of politics and betrayal, and one of ice and death. Far to the south, in King's Landing, anger burned. Tywin Lannister crushed the letter in his hand. They survived, he said quietly. Jaime stood across from him, leg bandaged from Jon's strike. Yes, Tywin's eyes were cold stone. Then we adapt. New alliances were already being considered. The Boltons were not fully crushed. Not yet. There were still houses in the north that might bend under pressure. The lion had lost its clean kill, but it had not lost its claws. Back in Winterfell, Robb stood on the battlements beside Jon, watching men train below. You changed everything, Robb said. Jon shook his head. You were always meant to lead. Robb gave a faint smile. Maybe, but now I understand something I didn't before. What? Robb's voice grew quieter. Mercy doesn't win wars. The wind howled across the walls. Somewhere far beyond the horizon, dark forces were gathering, both human and something far worse. The Red Wedding had been stopped, but the cost of survival was about to rise, and this time the North would not wait for betrayal to strike first. Winter came early that year, not the gentle kind that dusted the ground and melted by noon. This was the kind that settled deep into stone and bone. The air itself felt sharper, like the world was preparing for something cruel. Winterfell was no longer just a home. It was becoming a fortress. Men trained from sunrise to nightfall. Smiths hammered steel until their arms shook. Ravens flew in and out of the rookery without rest. Every lord in the north had been summoned. No one ignored the call this time. Robb Stark stood in the great hall with a map spread across the long table. Candles flickered over painted rivers and forests. Jon stood beside him. "The Freys are regrouping," Robb said quietly, "and the Lannisters are reinforcing Harrenhal." Jon studied the map. "They expect us to sit behind Moat Kylan." Robb nodded. "They expect us to be grateful we survived." A slow silence passed between them. Then Robb moved a carved wolf south across the map. "We won't." The plan was bold, dangerous, but clean. They would not march in open war like before, no banners waving proudly, no long columns of troops. Instead, small northern forces would move through forests and river paths, striking supply lines, destroying bridges, assassinating commanders loyal to the Freys and Boltons. If the enemy wanted dishonor, the North would answer in kind. Jon felt the weight of it. "This won't be like the last war," he said. Robb's eyes were colder now. "No, it won't." That night, Jon walked through the yard and found Grey Wind waiting near the gate. The direwolf's red eyes watched the darkness beyond the walls. Jon rested his hand on the wolf's head. "You should have been there," he murmured. "You would have torn them apart sooner." Grey Wind huffed softly as if he understood. Footsteps approached. It was Great Jon Umber. "The men are ready," Great Jon said. "Say the word, and we ride." Jon nodded. "We move before dawn." The first strike came 3 nights later. A Frey supply convoy moving north along the Trident vanished without a sound. By the time riders found the wreckage, the wagons were burned and every soldier was dead. The second strike was louder. A Bolton outpost near the Neck was attacked at midnight. No survivors. Whispers began spreading through the riverlands. "The wolves are hunting." In the south, fear grew faster than armies, but war always demands a response. One evening, a raven arrived in Winterfell bearing a familiar sigil, "Flayed Man" on pink. "Bolton." The message was simple. Roose Bolton was dead, but his bastard son had taken command of what remained of their forces, and he was offering something unexpected: alliance. Robb read the letter twice. "He thinks we're desperate," Robb said. Jon's jaw tightened. "He thinks we're fools." The Boltons had not been fully destroyed at the Twins. Some had escaped before Roose fell. Now they were trying to survive by switching sides again. Robb burned the letter without replying. "No more half-trust," he said. "No more divided loyalties." Jon studied his brother carefully. There was steel in him now that hadn't been there before. But even as the Southern War began shifting in their favor, troubling news came from the Wall. A raven arrived covered in frost. Jon read the message alone first. His face changed. "What is it?" Robb asked. Jon looked up slowly. "They've breached the Wall." The room went silent. "Wildlings?" Great Jon asked. Jon shook his head. "Not just wildlings. Dead villages had been found north of Castle Black. Entire ranger patrols gone without trace. And something had attacked the East Watch garrison at night. Something that did not bleed." Robb exhaled slowly. "So the stories are true." Jon nodded. "And if they push south, then everything else becomes meaningless." The room felt smaller. Robb looked at the map again. At the south, at the riverlands, at the burning Frey keeps. Then he moved the wolf north. "All southern raids pause," he commanded. Half our forces marched to the Wall. Murmurs rose immediately. "We're winning in the south." One lord protested, "And we'll lose everything if the North falls to the dead," Robb snapped. Silence followed. Jon felt a strange mix of dread and pride. Robb wasn't just fighting for a crown anymore. He was fighting for survival. That night, under a sky heavy with snow clouds, Jon and Robb stood on the battlements again. "If we march north," Jon said quietly, "the Lannisters will think we've weakened." "Let them," Robb replied. "And if they strike while we're gone?" Robb's voice was calm. "Then we strike back twice as hard." Jon studied him. "You changed." Robb looked out over Winterfell. "I had to." The wind picked up, carrying distant howls from the woods. Not just wolves. Something else moved in the darkness beyond the Wall. Something ancient. The North had survived betrayal. Now it would face something far worse. And this time it would not be a wedding hall soaked in blood. It would be snow. The march to the wall felt different from any war ride before. There were no songs, no boasts about glory, no talk of crowns. Only silence and the sound of boots crushing frozen ground. Robb rode at the head of 20,000 northern men. Banners snapped in the bitter wind, the direwolf flying high against a sky the color of steel. Jon rode beside him, black cloak, blending into the gray world around them. The closer they came to the wall, the colder it grew. Villages near the gift stood half empty. Doors hung open. Livestock wandered loose. Fires burned out in hearths. As if families had left in a hurry, they ran south. One scout reported. Said shadows were walking at night. Jon didn't need to hear more. When the wall finally rose into view, even the hardened northern soldiers fell quiet. It stood tall and white as ever. But something felt wrong. The top was lined with more torches than usual. Movement everywhere. Castle Black's gates opened quickly when they arrived. The Lord Commander stepped forward to meet them, his face pale and exhausted. "You came," he said simply. Robb nodded once. "We protect our own." Jon stepped forward. "How bad is it?" The Lord Commander hesitated. "Worse than we feared. They climbed the wall together. The wind at the top cut like knives. Snow swirled so thick it was hard to see more than a few hundred feet beyond. Then Jon saw them. Campfires. Thousands of them. Wildlings stretched across the frozen forest as far as the eye could see, but they weren't attacking. They were waiting. "They're not here to fight us," Jon said quietly. "No," the Lord Commander replied. "They're running from something." As if summoned by the words, a horn blast echoed from the tree line. Not the wildlings, something deeper, longer. 3 blasts. Every man on the wall froze. Jon felt his blood turn cold. 3 blasts meant one thing. White Walkers. The forest beyond the wildling camps began to move. Not with men, with shapes. Tall, pale figures gliding between trees, and behind them, a tide of bodies. Dead men, dead wildlings, dead animals, all walking. The wildling camp erupted into chaos as the army of the dead charged forward without sound. No battle cries, no rage, just cold purpose. "They're pushing them straight into us," Robb realized. Jon's mind raced. If the wildlings broke through the wall's gates in panic, the Night's Watch would be overwhelmed from within, while the dead pressed from outside. "We open the gates," Jon said suddenly. The Lord Commander turned sharply. "Are you mad? If we don't, they'll die out there and join that army." Jon snapped. "We need them alive." Robb stepped in immediately. "He's right." The decision took seconds. The gates began to open. Wildlings surged toward the wall, screaming desperate. Arrows from the top rained down on them, but on the dead charging behind. And then the first White Walker stepped into clear view. Tall, thin, armor like ice, eyes glowing blue. It raised a hand. The dead moved faster. They hit the wildlings like a wave. Jon drew Longclaw. "Lower the ropes," he shouted. "Get me down there." Robb grabbed his arm. "You don't fight this alone. You don't fight this alone." Before Jon could argue, Robb was already shouting orders. Northern archers lined the wall. Flaming arrows streaked into the undead ranks. Fire slowed them, but did not stop them. Jon descended with a small group of northern fighters just outside the gate, forming a defensive line to cover the retreating wildlings. The first white reached them. Jon cut it down. It kept moving. He slashed again, taking its head off. It fell. "Fire!" he yelled. Torches were thrown onto the bodies. Behind them, the White Walker moved forward calmly. Jon felt it watching him. The creature raised an icy blade. Jon stepped toward it. Steel met ice. Longclaw did not shatter. The White Walker's blade did. Shock flickered across its frozen face. Jon didn't hesitate. He drove Longclaw straight through its chest. The creature shattered like glass, and in the distance dozens of whites collapsed with it. A ripple of hope spread through the defenders, but there were more, far more. Robb had joined the fight below now, refusing to remain on the wall. Grey wind tore into the dead with savage fury. The battle raged for hours. Fire, steel, screams. When dawn finally broke, the field beyond the wall was covered in ash and frozen limbs. The dead had retreated, not defeated, just testing. Jon stood breathing hard, surrounded by survivors, both black cloaks and wildlings. Robb approached him slowly. "So," Robb said quietly, staring at the battlefield, "this is the real war." Jon nodded. "Yes." Behind the broken tree line far in the distance, a single tall figure watched from the shadows, blue eyes glowing. The Night King had seen the sword that could kill his kind, and now he knew exactly who carried it. The cold that followed the first battle did not leave. It stayed in the air, in the ground, in the bones of every man standing at the wall. They had won that night, if you could call it that. The wildlings who survived were now inside the gates, cold, frightened, but alive. Fires burned constantly in Castle Black. The wounded filled every corner. The smell of smoke and blood never faded, but the silence beyond the wall was worse than the battle. Jon stood at the top again 2 days later, staring into the endless white forest. "They're watching," he said quietly. Robb joined him, fur cloak wrapped tight. "How do you know?" Jon didn't look away. "Because we hurt them." That was the truth of it. Killing one of the White Walkers had changed something. The Night King now knew the North had a weapon that could destroy his generals. And enemies like that didn't ignore threats, they erased them. Scouts were sent out carefully. Most didn't return. One came back near death, frostbitten, shaking. "They're not marching straight at us," he whispered. "They're moving east and west." Jon felt it immediately. "They're spreading." Robb understood just as fast. "They're going around the wall." The Night King wasn't stupid. He wasn't going to throw his army blindly against ice and fire again. He was searching for weakness. Eastwatch. The Shadow Tower. Thin, forgotten places where the wall wasn't as strong. "We can't defend all of it," the Lord Commander admitted during the War Council that night. The map lay open again, but this time it was different from the Southern War. There were no politics here. No betrayals. Just survival. Jon placed markers along the wall. "If he breaks through even one section, the North burns," he said. Robb leaned forward. "Then we make him attack where we're strongest." A dangerous idea formed. They would pull men from weaker castles and concentrate them at Eastwatch, the most vulnerable but most strategic point. It was a risk, a gamble. But Robb had learned something at the Twins. Waiting to be betrayed was death. Forcing the enemy to commit, that was power. The decision was made. The march to Eastwatch began within hours. The wildlings, now under temporary truce, marched with them. Tormund Giantsbane walked beside Jon without speaking much. The big wildling leader had seen enough. To know pride meant nothing against the dead. "They'll come at night," Tormund muttered finally. Jon nodded. "They always do." 3 nights later, the sky turned black long before sunset. A storm unlike any other rolled in from the far north. Snow fell sideways. The sea near Eastwatch froze along its edges. And then the horns blew. Not one, not three. Hundreds. From the darkness beyond the blizzard, shapes moved. This time the army was bigger, much bigger. They didn't charge wildly. They moved in formation, organized. The Night King had adapted. Jon stood at the front lines, long claw in hand. Robb beside him, sword drawn. Northern shields locked together. Wildlings, gripping axes and spears. The dead hit them like a tidal wave. The impacts shattered the outer barricades instantly. Fire pits slowed some, but the storm weakened the flames. Whites climbed over each other, uncaring of the blades that cut them down. Robb fought like a man possessed. Grey Wind leaped and tore, but even the direwolf was forced back under sheer numbers. Jon saw another White Walker approaching through the storm, then another, and another. "They're targeting you," Robb shouted over the chaos. He was right. The Night King had not forgotten who shattered his general. Jon pushed forward, cutting through whites, forcing his way toward the White Walker nearest him. Their blades met. Ice screamed against Valyrian steel. Jon moved faster this time, smarter. He shattered the creature with a clean strike. More whites fell instantly, but the victory lasted seconds, because behind them, The Night King himself stepped into view. He did not rush, he did not shout. He simply walked forward, calm and unstoppable. The storm seemed to bend around him. Blue eyes locked onto Jon. Everything slowed. Even the battle sounds felt distant. The Night King raised one hand. Every fallen body on the battlefield began to rise. Dead Northerners, dead wildlings, even fallen Night's Watch brothers. They stood again and turned. Panic ripped through the defenders. Robb grabbed Jon's shoulder. Fall back. But Jon couldn't move. The Night King was coming straight toward him. This wasn't random. This was personal. Arrows flew toward the Night King and froze in midair before dropping uselessly. Jon stepped forward. If this was the moment, he would not run. Robb moved with him. Side by side. Brothers. The Night King drew his ice blade. The storm roared louder. And the real battle. Not for the wall, not for the north, but for the future of the living, was about to begin. The storm swallowed everything. Snow spun so thick, it felt like the world had turned white and empty, leaving only two armies and one frozen god standing between them. Jon could barely hear anything now. The clash of steel, the screams, even the sea crashing against the ice below Eastwatch, all of it sounded distant. The Night King walked forward slowly, calm, certain. Robb stepped slightly in front of Jon. "We do this together." Jon shook his head. "If I fall, you won't," Robb said firmly. Another wave of whites crashed into the northern line. Men were dragged down. The dead that rose moments later turned on their former brothers without hesitation. The Night King lifted his blade. Jon felt something strange in the air, not just cold, pressure, like the world itself was holding its breath. Then the Night King moved. Faster than anything human, Jon barely managed to raise Long Claw in time. Ice struck steel with a force that sent shock through his entire arm. He staggered back, boots sliding on frozen ground. Robb attacked from the side, swinging hard at the Night King's torso. The ice blade met Robb's sword. Robb's steel shattered instantly. The sound was like a cracking tree. Robb stumbled back, staring at the broken weapon in disbelief. Jon lunged forward again, slashing at the Night King's side. The blade connected. Frost exploded outward, but the Night King did not fall. He turned, grabbing Jon by the throat with unnatural strength. Jon felt himself lifted off the ground. The cold burned worse than fire. Across the battlefield, men screamed as more of the dead rose. Robb roared and tackled the Night King from behind, forcing him to release Jon. Both brothers crashed into the snow. Jon rolled, gasping, lungs burning. The Night King rose again, calm as ever. His blue eyes locked onto Robb this time, and something terrible happened. The Night King pointed his blade toward Robb. The ground beneath Robb froze instantly, ice crawling up his boots, locking him in place. Jon saw it and moved without thinking. He charged. Longclaw swung with everything he had left. The blade cut through the Night King's arm at the elbow. The frozen limb shattered and fell. A sound echoed across the battlefield. Not a scream, but something deeper. A crack in the air itself. Whites all around them dropped again, lifeless. The Night King stepped back for the first time, not defeated, but wounded. Blue eyes burned brighter with rage. The severed arm began reforming from swirling ice. Jon realized the truth in that moment. He couldn't win this alone. No one could. Robb broke free from the ice, grabbing a fallen spear tipped with dragon glass. "Jon!" he shouted. Jon understood. As the Night King lunged forward again, Jon met him head-on, locking blades, forcing him to focus. Robb circled behind. The dragon glass spear drove forward, straight through the Night King's back. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then cracks of blue light spread across the Night King's body. He turned his head slowly, almost surprised. Jon pulled Longclaw free and struck again, shattering the spear deeper into him. The Night King's body fractured like frozen glass and exploded into a storm of ice shards. The wind stopped instantly. The blizzard died all across the battlefield. Every white collapsed at once. Silence, heavy, absolute. Jon dropped to his knees, breath shaking. Robb stood frozen, staring at where the Night King had been. It was over. Or at least, this part was. Around them, survivors slowly realized the dead were no longer moving. Cries of disbelief turned into exhausted laughter. Men wept openly. The wall still stood. The North still stood. Jon looked at Robb. Robb looked back. No crown, no politics, no titles, just two brothers who had survived something that should have killed them both. "You saved me," Robb said quietly. Jon gave a tired, almost broken smile. "You returned the favor." Dawn broke slowly over Eastwatch. The battlefield was nothing but frozen bodies and shattered ice. The cost had been terrible, but the Night King was gone. For now, Jon stared north into the endless white beyond the wall. Somewhere deep inside, he felt it. This wasn't the end of war. The Lannisters still ruled the South. The Freys still breathed, and now the North had proven something undeniable. It could defeat death itself, and that would terrify every throne in the Seven Kingdoms. Robb placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. "We go south," he said, "not as boys chasing honor, not as victims of betrayal, but as wolves who had faced the darkness and lived." The news spread faster than fire in dry grass. The Night King was dead. The army of the dead had fallen. The wall still stood. At first, the South did not believe it. In King's Landing, lords laughed at the rumor. They called it northern exaggeration, wild tales to gain sympathy. But then more ravens came. From Eastwatch, from Castle Black, from merchants who had seen the frozen battlefield themselves. The North had faced death itself, and won. In the Red Keep, Tywin Lannister read the reports in silence. His fingers tapped lightly against the table. Across from him stood Jaime, leg healed but pride still bruised from the twins. "So," Jaime said quietly, "the wolves kill monsters now." Tywin's voice was calm, but there was tension beneath it. Men who defeat fear become dangerous, because that was the truth. The North was no longer just rebelling. It had become legend, and legends inspired loyalty. In Winterfell, Robb called his banners once more. The great hall filled again, but this time the mood was different. Not grief, not fear, resolve. "We gave the South time to help us," Robb said, his voice steady. "They sent nothing. Murmurs of agreement. We bled alone," Greyjon growled. Robb nodded. "And we survived alone." Jon stood beside him, quieter now than before. The battle with the Night King had changed him. He carried himself differently, not heavier, just clearer. Robb continued. "The Lannisters tried to slaughter us at the Twins. They waited while we fought the dead. They believed we would fall. He let that sit in the room. They were wrong." A roar built slowly among the northern lords. "This time," Robb said, "we march south, not for revenge alone, but to end this. No more half-wars, no more broken truces. The plan was direct. Moat Cailin would hold the north secure. The main host would ride for the Riverlands first, wiping out what remained of House Frey completely. No survivors to scheme again. Then they would push toward King's Landing, not recklessly, but relentlessly." Before the march began, Robb stood alone in the Godswood. Jon joined him quietly. The Heart Tree watched in silence. "If we take the Iron Throne," Robb said, "everything changes." Jon looked at the carved face in the weirwood. "Do you want it?" Robb was quiet for a long time. "I want the North safe," he said finally. "If ruling all of it is the only way to do that, then yes." Jon nodded slowly. "You'd be a better king than most who've sat there." Robb gave a small smile. "And you?" Jon looked down at Longclaw. "I never wanted crowns." "You never wanted to be a hero either," Robb replied. That made Jon almost laugh. The march south began at first light, and it was nothing like before. This time the Riverlands opened their gates willingly. The Freys, weakened and terrified after the failed Red Wedding and northern raids, fell quickly. Their castle at the Twins burned for 3 days. No songs were played, no weddings were held. The North remembered. As they pushed further south, houses that once feared Lannister gold began shifting allegiance. The story of Eastwatch traveled with them. Men whispered they defeated the dead. Fear of lions faded next to that. When the Northern Army finally stood within sight of King's Landing, the golden banners atop its walls looked smaller than they once had. Inside, tension cracked like thin ice. Tywin Lannister was old, clever, but even he knew when a tide was turning. Robb Stark did not demand surrender. He offered terms. The North would remain independent, the Riverlands freed from Lannister control, debts forgiven, alliances redrawn, or the wolves would tear down the gates. For 3 days no answer came. On the fourth, the gates opened, not from fire, not from siege, but from fear. The Lannisters agreed to terms, not because they loved peace, but because they had seen what happened to those who betrayed the North. Robb Stark never sat the Iron Throne. He didn't need to. Instead, a treaty was signed recognizing the North as its own kingdom once more. The Riverlands aligned with it. The Southern Crown weakened, forced into uneasy balance. And for the first time in generations, the North stood free. On the day they returned to Winterfell, snow fell gently from a clear sky. No storm, no war horns, just quiet. Robb stood before his people again, crowned king in the North, not by rebellion, but by survival. Jon stood at his side, not as a bastard, not as an exile, but as the brother who had changed history the night he walked into the Red Wedding. Later, alone on the battlements, Robb looked at him. "You saved me twice," Robb said. Jon shook his head lightly. "You chose to fight." Robb smiled faintly. "So did you." Below them, Winterfell lived again. Children ran through the yard. Blacksmiths worked without urgency. The air felt lighter. The war had cost them much, but the North had endured betrayal, lions, and death itself, and it was still standing. Jon looked out across the white horizon. For once, there were no enemies marching toward it. For once, the wolves could rest, not because the world had become gentle, but because they had become stronger than it. And it had all changed the moment Jon Snow walked into a wedding that was meant to be a funeral.